The glow of my phone lit the dark kitchen as I stared at an $80,000 Dubai charge tied to my own son's login. Still, I kept my thumb hovering over the screen, pretending it didn't hurt that the thief shared my blood. As the refrigerator's low hum thickened, it felt like the house itself was asking why a son would betray his father. While that sound vibrated in my chest, I followed the trail, straight to his wife's family and their luxury gift. The same cold hum told me Eric hadn't just cloned my card. He'd funded his father-in-law's trip with my life savings. That's when I whispered the only decision a betrayed father has left: freeze everything, even mid-flight. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. George Whitman had developed the habit of checking his bank statements the way other men his age checked the weather, quietly, methodically, every few days, more out of routine than worry. At 72, he lived a simple life in his small Cleveland home, where the loudest sound most mornings was the soft crackle of his old radiator warming the house. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, tapping through his online banking portal, expecting nothing more dramatic than a grocery charge or the utility bill. But then a line item made him pause. $4,200, Emirates premium seating. The description sat on the screen like it didn't belong in his world. For a moment he stared at it, blinking. Emirates, premium seating. He'd never flown with Emirates. He'd never flown premium anything. The last time he'd stepped foot on a plane was for his wife's funeral arrangements, and even then he'd chosen the cheapest fare, wanting every dime to go toward giving her a proper goodbye. This wasn't him. Surely it was a bank error, some digital mix-up. Those happen sometimes, right? He reached for his glasses, cleaned them with the edge of his flannel sleeve, and checked again. Still $4,200, still Emirates, still wrong. With a slow exhale, George tapped the number on the back of his debit card. The automated menu felt endless, a maze of robotic prompts asking him to rate his level of emergency. When he finally reached a human voice, he felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment, as if he were apologizing for bothering a stranger with something trivial. The rep transferred him to the fraud department, and after a moment of static, a warm, steady voice came through. Bank of Ohio Security, this is Tyler. What can I help you with today? George cleared his throat. Hi, yes, I think I have an incorrect charge, a pretty big one. Let's take a look, Tyler said, typing in the background. Can you confirm the transaction? Emirates premium seating, $4,200. Tyler whistled softly. That's significant. Give me 1 second. More typing. A pause, faster typing. Mr. Whitman, I see the charge, and I'm also seeing several pending transactions that haven't cleared yet. George felt a tiny pulse of worry. Pending? What kind? Electronics, luxury hotels, international lounges. Looks like these are linked to overseas travel. George's heart dipped. Overseas? That didn't make sense. That can't be me. I agree, Tyler said gently. Based on the pattern, it looks like your card may have been cloned. These purchases are consistent with travel bookings. Cloned. The word hit him harder than he expected. Someone had his card. Someone was spending his money, his carefully saved money. The money he still guarded like his wife was alive and watching him manage their nest egg the way she taught him to. He pressed his palm to his forehead. All right, well, I'll do whatever you need. Let's stop it before it gets worse. We'll monitor activity, Tyler reassured. If anything else posts, we'll call you immediately. After ending the call, George sat in silence for a moment, staring at the mug of coffee that had gone cold. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, like the walls were inching closer. He needed air, or company, or at least someone to talk to, and instinctively, without thinking too hard about it, he scrolled to Eric's name. His only son. Hey, Dad, Eric answered after a couple rings, the words fast, clipped like he'd been interrupted. Everything okay? George tried to keep his voice steady. Yeah, just checking in. Had a weird bank issue today." There was a tiny, almost imperceptible pause on the other end. "Bank issue." "Yeah, probably nothing. They think my card got cloned." "Oh wow, that's crazy." Eric sounded distracted. "But I'm sure it'll get fixed." George frowned. Eric sounded off, nervous maybe, but he shook it away. People were busy. Work, family, life. He didn't want to read into things. "Anyway, just thought I'd say hi." "Yeah, thanks, Dad. I'm in the middle of something, but we'll talk soon, okay?" "Sure," George said softly. The line went dead, and George stared at his phone for a long second. Something about that call didn't settle right, but maybe he was just rattled. Fraud had a way of making everything feel blurry, suspicious. He went back to his computer and reopened the bank page, eyes bouncing between numbers as if the screen might change while he watched. He tried to convince himself this was a one-off, a random cyber thief, someone halfway across the world who'd never think about him again. Before heading to bed, he clicked into his account settings and turned on alerts, text notifications for every single transaction. A small measure of control, but control nonetheless. If anything else happened, he'd know right away. He lay down that night with the faint glow of his phone on the nightstand, the quiet house swallowing the sound of his steady breathing. And even though he tried to calm himself, remind himself the bank was handling it, a strange unease lingered at the back of his mind. Heavy, whispering, waiting. What he didn't know was that by morning, that unease would come alive. George woke to a sound he couldn't immediately place, an insistent, repetitive buzzing that cut through the quiet of his bedroom. For a moment he lay still, disoriented, the room still dark except for the thin blue glow of the digital clock on his dresser. 3:04 a.m. The buzzing continued, vibrating the wooden nightstand. He reached for his phone, expecting maybe an Amber Alert or some glitch. But it wasn't one alert. It was dozens. His lock screen was stacked with text notifications from the bank. Transaction alert. Another transaction alert. Another transaction alert. His pulse kicked hard as he swiped the screen open. The first message showed a transaction for $7,850, Burj Al Arab. The next one listed $2,600, Desert Luxury Tour. Then $4,900, Dubai Marina Transfer. More followed, rolling in one after another in a dizzying waterfall of numbers, each one higher than the last. George sat up in bed, the phone trembling in his hand. Dubai, Burj Al Arab, luxury tour. These weren't random online purchases or some hacker buying electronics off a dark website. This was someone living extravagantly on his money halfway across the world. He clicked into the bank's app. The activity feed looked like a slot machine that had gotten stuck in jackpot mode. $80,000 in pending charges, all within a window of 4 hours. George swung his legs off the bed, suddenly breathless. $80,000. More money than he'd ever spent in one night in his entire life. He had saved that money carefully, dollar by dollar, paycheck by paycheck, even after retirement, because that's what a responsible man did, and because that's what his wife would have wanted. Since her death 5 years earlier, he'd guarded those savings with a quiet vigilance. Now they were disappearing in the dark without him even leaving his house. He sat at the edge of the bed, fingers digging into his knees as a cold wave of panic spread through him. "God, no," he whispered. "No, no, no." His mind raced. Who would do this? Who had access? Who even knew his spending limits? His breathing unsteady, George dialed the bank's after-hours emergency line. A different representative this time, but the script was the same. Verify name, verify address, verify last 4 digits. He read off the recent charges, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. The rep froze the card immediately, but told George he would need to visit a branch first thing in the morning to file the full fraud claim. So George waited. He paced the living room until the first hint of dawn seeped through the curtains, gray and thin, like a world waking as reluctantly as he was. He didn't bother making coffee. Didn't bother changing out of the clothes he'd thrown on at 3:30. The moment the bank doors unlocked at 8 a.m., he was inside, leaning slightly on the counter as he asked to speak with Tyler. Tyler's face tightened when he saw the list of charges. He motioned George into a private office and shut the door behind them. "Mr. Whitman, this is severe," he said quietly, scanning page after page. "Whoever cloned your card went all in." George folded his hands together to keep them from shaking. "I don't understand how they did it. I don't understand why." Tyler clicked through the logs. "Look, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the pattern here, the speed of the transactions, the type of bookings, it doesn't look like a random cyber thief. Someone knew exactly where to spend and what your card could handle." He paused, then added with careful weight, "It's often someone the victim knows." George stared at him, stunned. The idea felt too personal, too ugly. Someone he knew, someone he trusted. His mind tried to reject it. Tyler went on, "We'll get to the bottom of it, but I suggest checking with anyone who might have had access, even indirectly." George nodded numbly. There were very few people who even knew his financial situation. Very few. Who he would ever hand his wallet to. One, really, just one. He stepped out of the bank into the cold morning air and immediately dialed Eric. The call rang once, twice, 3 times straight to voicemail. George tried again, and again. No answer, not even a declined call, just straight to voicemail like the phone was off or ignored. He lowered the phone slowly, his throat tightening. A strange, hollow sensation spread through his chest, fear mixing with something darker, something he didn't want to name, something he wasn't ready to believe. But the feeling was there anyway, forming quietly in the shadows of his thoughts. A gut-deep whisper of betrayal. George wasn't sure whether he slept at all. Morning crept in through the blinds, stretching long stripes of pale light across the living room floor, but he remained on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. The weight of the night still pressed on him. $80,000 vanished, calls unanswered, suspicions he hated himself for even entertaining. He kept telling himself there had to be another explanation, something rational, something decent. Around 10, a knock came at the door, 3 short taps, then a pause, then one more. Only one person knocked like that. "George, you awake?" Janice's voice floated through the wood. She lived next door and had for decades. After his wife died, she made a quiet habit of checking on him, not intrusive, just present. He opened the door, trying to look composed, but Janice's face softened instantly. "You look pale," she said. "Everything all right?" George hesitated, debating how much to share, but the exhaustion made the decision for him. "I've had a rough night." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and set her phone on the coffee table. "Well, maybe this is a terrible time, but I think you should see something." She tapped her screen, navigating to Instagram, one of those apps George barely understood. A video began playing. Music, flashy graphics, a bright airport lounge with gold accents and soft leather seats. Then a man appeared at the center of the frame, grinning ear to ear. Harold Kemp, Lindsay's father. George stiffened. Harold stood in front of a business-class gate, wearing oversized sunglasses indoors, holding a glass of champagne like he was starring in a commercial. Lindsay's username glowed at the top, at Lindsay Whitman Official. "Listen up, everyone," Harold boomed in the video, his voice theatrical. "Headed to Dubai for a week of pure luxury, all expenses paid, courtesy of family." He winked at the camera. "When you marry right, you travel right." Janice looked at George carefully. "There's more." She paused the video and zoomed in on the right edge of the frame. At first it looked like nothing, just a sleeve. But George leaned closer, squinting. The fabric was a faded blue, frayed at the cuff, with a distinctive stitched patch near the wrist. He'd seen it 1,000 times. "That's Eric's jacket," George whispered. Janice nodded quietly. "I thought so too." It hit George like a blow, hard enough to make him sit back on the couch, breath shallow. That jacket was practically a uniform for Eric on casual days. He'd owned it for years. He wore it on camping trips, on errands, on almost every family visit. There was no mistaking it. His son was at the airport. His son was on the same Dubai flight. His son was standing beside Harold, on a trip George had unknowingly funded. Every charge from the night, every luxury booking, every lounge, every transfer, it all aligned. Not random fraud, not a stranger across the world. Eric had done it. George stared at the paused video, the image sharp and cruel. His throat burned, his ears rang. It felt like the room was tilting, like gravity had turned sideways. "No," he murmured. He wouldn't do that. But the evidence sat right there on the screen, undeniable. Janice placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, George." He didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind spiraled through memories, teaching Eric how to ride a bike, sitting through school plays, helping him move into his first apartment, covering a rent shortfall once when he'd been laid off. Moments where trust had been a given, not a question. "And he didn't even call me back," George muttered, his voice cracking. "He ignored every call." Janice didn't speak. She simply stood beside him, quiet in the way people are when words would only make things worse. After she left, George stayed on the couch, staring at nothing, the video replaying over and over in his mind. Harold bragging, champagne in hand, while his son lingered just off frame like a guilty shadow. Nearly an hour passed before George finally reached for his phone again. His hand shook as he tapped Eric's name. He held the phone to his ear and listened to it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. He hung up, dialed again, straight to voicemail this time. The hope he'd been stubbornly clinging to all night, the belief that maybe this was some misunderstanding, maybe foul luck, maybe a technical glitch, crumbled. He set the phone down with a quiet finality. The confusion was gone now. The shock was fading. What rose in its place was something colder, sharper, something he hadn't felt in years, not since the night he lost his wife and realized the world could take from him without mercy. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed, breath steadying. If his own son had truly done this, if Eric had drained his savings to impress a man like Harold, if he had left George to discover it through alerts and Instagram posts, then this wasn't just fraud. It was betrayal. And betrayal had a way of awakening parts of a man he thought were long buried. George picked up his phone again, not to call, not to text, but simply to hold it, feeling the weight of what came next settling over him like a storm rolling in. The anger wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was slow, cold, deliberate, and it was only just beginning. George drove through the quiet Cleveland suburbs with his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck ached. The sun was barely up, a thin gray wash spreading across the streets as he turned corner after corner toward Eric's house. He didn't know exactly what he planned to say. He didn't even know if Eric was home. All he knew was that he couldn't sit in his living room another minute replaying the Instagram video. He needed answers. He needed truth, spoken to his face, not hidden behind silence and blocked calls. When he pulled into Eric's driveway, the house looked like it always did. Tidy lawn, neatly swept porch, not a single curtain out of place. But today everything about it felt wrong. Hollow. Like the front door wasn't just a door, but the threshold between the life he thought he had and the one he was actually living in. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door swung open. Lindsay stood there. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, a robe that somehow looked expensive enough to wear on a runway, and a smile, smug, polished, too controlled. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "George, didn't know you were stopping by." George swallowed hard. "Is Eric here?" She leaned casually against the doorframe. No, he's traveling. I know, George said quietly. Her smile grew, sharpened. Dubai, family generosity goes a long way, doesn't it? The words hit him like a slap. She said them lightly, like a joke, but there was an edge underneath, an implication he couldn't ignore. Family generosity, his generosity, money he didn't give, money that had been taken. He tried to keep his composure. I need to talk to him. It's important. I'm sure it is, she said, folding her arms. But he's very busy right now. You know, international travel, luxury hotels, the whole experience. It's been a dream for him. Behind her, George noticed something on the kitchen counter. A corner of paper, glossy, bright colors. He squinted. Is that? Lindsay followed his line of sight. For a split second, her expression shifted, tightened, then smoothed back into its practiced calm. Just some travel paperwork. But George stepped forward and she didn't stop him. Maybe she thought he wouldn't actually look. Maybe she underestimated him. But he walked right past her and reached the counter. There it was. A printed itinerary with bold letters. Dubai International Airport, Emirates Business Class, Burj Al Arab check-in. His stomach dropped. And then he saw it, bottom corner, faint but visible, tucked in the details. The last 4 digits of his own card number. His card, his money, his son's trip. Not stolen by strangers. Not a hacked account. Not a coincidence. His own son had booked a luxury vacation using his identity, his savings, apparently without hesitation, without guilt, without even telling him. Lindsay let out a soft breath behind him, like she'd been waiting for the moment he saw it. Eric handled it, she said. He said it was fine. George turned slowly, staring at her. He used my card. She gave a shrug that was almost mocking. It was available, and you know how Eric gets. He didn't want to look small in front of my family. He wanted to contribute. You should be proud, honestly. It's a big gesture. Proud. The word made something inside him twist painfully. Proud of what? That his son had lied, stolen, used him like a bank account with no voice attached. I need you to leave, Lindsay said suddenly, as if the moment had bored her. I have things to do before they land. George felt heat flood his face, humiliation settling deep in his chest. He wasn't going to argue with her. Not here. Not now. Not while his anger was this raw, this dangerous. He nodded once, fine. He walked out, past her cold smile, past the doorway that suddenly felt like a stranger's home, not his son's. He got into his car and sat there for a long moment with his hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles pale and trembling. Eric wasn't irresponsive. Ibble. Eric wasn't confused. Eric was complicit. The realization didn't come with screaming or chaos. It came with a numb, deadly clarity, like ice settling under the skin. This wasn't a moment he could fix with a disappointed lecture or fatherly guidance. This was deliberate betrayal. He started the car and drove home slowly, every mile heavier than the last. When he stepped into his quiet house again, the silence felt different, thicker, suffocating, filled not with peace but humiliation. He lowered himself onto the couch, elbows on his knees, breathing through the ache in his chest. His own son. His own money. His own downfall. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the humiliation only sank deeper, spreading like a bruise he knew wouldn't fade quickly. And somewhere beneath it, something colder began to take shape. A resolve forming. A shift beginning. Because if Eric had played him this badly, then George needed to think differently. Smarter. And the time for hoping his son would do the right thing had officially ended. George had barely slept after leaving Eric's house. The humiliation clung to him like cold sweat, Lindsay's smirk, the itinerary on the counter, his card number printed casually on a luxury booking as if his life savings were nothing more than a convenient donation. By mid-morning, he sat at his kitchen table again, phone face up, its silence somehow louder than any ringing could have been. He expected nothing and everything at once, an apology, a confession, a lie. Mostly lies, probably. But Eric didn't call. Instead, the phone buzzed with an incoming number he recognized immediately. "Tyler," George answered before the second ring. "Please tell me you have something." "I do," Tyler said, his tone sharper than usual. "Mr. Whitman, I tracked the authorization trail. The Dubai flight they booked, it's already airborne." George's heart thudded. Of course it was. He'd seen the itinerary. He knew they were halfway across the Atlantic by now. So what does that mean? "It means," Tyler continued, "the card is still being used, even on the plane. They're charging attempting upgrades, in-flight purchases, Wi-Fi packages, anything they can squeeze through before the fraud block fully hits." George shut his eyes for a second. Eric, his son, sitting 20,000 feet above the ocean, sipping champagne he didn't earn, trying to squeeze out every last dollar George had worked 40 years to save. Tyler spoke again, low and steady. "I can freeze everything mid-flight, every account tied to your profile. They won't be able to buy a cup of coffee on that plane." George hesitated, a long breath leaving him like he'd been holding it since yesterday. This wasn't just a financial decision. Freezing everything meant halting their entire trip, humiliating them, stranding them, forcing the truth to crash into their plans like a brick. For a moment he pictured Eric as a little boy again, mud on his shoes, sticky hands, running through the backyard like the world was harmless. Then that image burned away, replaced by the memory of the itinerary on the counter. Lindsay's face. Harold bragging online. George opened his eyes. "Do it," he said. "Freeze everything, every account right now." "Are you sure?" Tyler asked. "I've never been more sure in my life." There was a quick rhythm of typing on the other end. "Okay, initiating now." Another pause, more typing. "Done. All transactions will start declining immediately." George felt something shift inside him. Not joy, not satisfaction, but a cold clarity. A boundary he should have set years ago had finally slammed into place. Tyler continued, "I'll send you updates as they hit. If they try anything else midair, you'll see it." "Thank you," George said, "truly." After ending the call, he sat back, letting the moment settle. There was no undoing this, no gentle reset. This was the first real line he'd drawn against his son, and it was a heavy one. Instinctively, almost without thinking, he picked up his phone and opened Instagram, even though he hated the app, searching Lindsay's profile again. The latest story was only minutes old. A shaky video shot inside the Emirates cabin. The atmosphere was loud, tense, passengers craning their necks as a man argued with the flight attendant. George pressed the volume button. Harold's voice blasted through the speakers. "What do you mean the upgrade is declined? My family paid for priority." His voice was shrill, angrier than George had ever heard. "Run it again. Don't you know who I?" The video cut off abruptly, replaced by a black screen and Lindsay's passive-aggressive caption. "Some people don't appreciate our status." George stared at the final frame. His pulse was steady. Too steady. Something inside him, long dormant, was waking up. Not rage exactly, but a sense of control he had ceded for far too long. He finally felt like he was standing on solid ground, not being dragged behind his son's choices like a man tied to a speeding truck. A moment later, his phone vibrated again, this time with a message notification. "Eric, Dad, what did you do?" Another buzz. "Eric, everything's freezing. We can't access anything, Dad." George read the messages in silence. He could picture it vividly. Eric in his cramped business-class seat, panicked, humiliated in front of Lindsay's family, scrambling to salvage the ruin he'd caused. For the first time, George didn't feel guilty. He typed slowly, each word deliberate. "George, I protected what's mine." He hit send. A stillness settled in the room, not peace exactly, but space. Breathing space, thinking space. Maybe, for the first time since this nightmare began, the imbalance had shifted. Maybe Eric finally understood there were consequences, and maybe George wasn't as powerless as he'd allowed himself to believe. He set the phone down, the faint echo of Harold's mid-air tantrum still ringing in his ears. Something told him the fallout hadn't even begun. By the time the sun dipped behind the row of houses across the street, George's phone buzzed again, not with a call this time, but with a notification from the very Instagram account he wished he could block from the world. Lindsay had posted something new. He opened it reluctantly, bracing himself. A black screen with white text appeared, styled like one of those motivational quotes people use to disguise arrogance. Some people can't stand our success. No explanation, no hint of the chaos unraveling around them. Just a smug, passive-aggressive swipe aimed squarely at him, as if she were the victim, as if they hadn't drained his accounts and been caught mid-flight. George exhaled through his nose, the kind of slow, controlled breath a man takes to keep from snapping. He scrolled once more. Another new upload, this time from Harold's account. In the video, Harold stood in the middle of the Dubai airport terminal, red-faced and sweaty, his voice echoing under the high ceilings. "This is an outrage," he shouted, shoving his phone toward the camera. "Financial betrayal mid-flight. Imagine paying for premium only to be downgraded to nothing because someone suddenly froze the funds. Completely unacceptable. We'll get to the bottom of this. Mark my words." George didn't finish watching. He set the phone down like it was something toxic. The shift that had begun with the mid-flight freeze now felt complete. They weren't just angry, they were exposed. Their pride was wounded, their carefully curated image cracked open for the world to see. And they still hadn't admitted what they'd done. George grabbed his coat and keys. The day had been spent reacting, finding out, confronting, freezing accounts. Now it was time to take the next step, the formal one, the one that might finally protect him from whatever Eric and Lindsay tried next. The police station was quiet when he walked in, the fluorescent lights humming softly. A young officer at the front desk looked up. "Evening, sir. How can we help?" "I need to file a fraud report," George said. "A large one." They ushered him into a small room with neutral walls and a faint smell of old coffee. After a few minutes, a detective stepped in, mid-40s, sharp eyes, presence calm but commanding. "Detective Maria O'Neill," she introduced herself, offering a firm handshake. "Let's start from the beginning." For the next 40 minutes, George laid it all out. Every charge, every alert, every detail he'd pieced together. He showed her the screenshots, the timestamps, the itinerary with his card number, the Instagram posts that caught everything in broad daylight. Detective O'Neill didn't dismiss a single piece. She didn't rush him or treat him like an elderly man confused by technology. When he finished, she leaned back slightly and nodded. "Mr. Whitman, this is serious, very serious, and based on what you've shown me, it appears intentional." George felt something tighten in his chest, not shock but validation. Finally, someone saw the truth without him having to justify it. "I'll file this as a high-priority case," she continued. "Family fraud happens more often than people think, but it's still fraud. We'll be in touch soon." George thanked her quietly and stepped back into the cold evening, the wind biting at his cheeks. He felt both heavier and lighter, carrying the weight of finality, shedding the weight of silence. He had barely made it home when his phone rang again. "Eric." The name lit up the screen like a flare. Against his better judgment, George answered. A burst of frantic noise hit his ear, airport announcements, echoing voices, and Eric's breathless panic. "Dad, Dad, finally. Oh my God, something's wrong. We can't pay for anything. The hotel won't check us in. Lindsay's screaming. Harold's losing it. You have to fix this, please, just fix it." George closed his eyes. The desperation in Eric's voice was real, but it wasn't remorse. It wasn't accountability. It was fear of consequences, his consequences, not the damage he'd caused. "Dad," Eric repeated, voice cracking. "Please, we're stuck here, just turn it back on. We'll talk when we get home, I swear we will." George lifted the phone from his ear, staring at nothing for a long, quiet second. Then he brought it back and spoke in a calm, level tone. "I can't fix what I didn't break." Dad, wait." George pressed the red button. The call ended. He set the phone down gently, his hand steady, his breath steady, his resolve steady. The chaos had begun, but for the first time in days, George felt something close to certainty. And he knew the next storm was already on its way. The house was quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm, not peaceful, but suspended, waiting for whatever comes next. George woke early, not because he slept well, but because his mind refused to rest. He brewed coffee he knew he wouldn't finish and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from the mug like it held answers he still didn't have. At 6:42 a.m. his phone buzzed. "Eric." A text this time. Then another. Then another. And within a minute, the screen lit up with a stream of frantic messages, each more chaotic than the last. "Dad, I'm sorry. You don't understand what happened. Harold pressured me. He said we had to go big or we'd look pathetic. Lindsay told me you wouldn't mind. She said you'd be supportive. I was stressed, Dad. I wasn't thinking straight." George read each message slowly, eyes narrowing with every line. Eric wasn't apologizing. He was scrambling, blaming, redirecting. Anything to avoid saying the one thing that mattered: "I did this to you." Another message arrived. "I didn't clone anything, Dad. Harold handled the bookings. Or maybe Lindsay did, I don't know. It wasn't me. Not really." George exhaled a long, tired breath. Stress, pressure, Harold, Lindsay, excuses forming a circle with no center. He felt no satisfaction watching Eric unravel, only a deep, heavy ache, like mourning something he wasn't sure he ever had. Still, he saved every message. He created a folder on his phone titled Evidence and moved them all inside, not out of spite, but out of necessity, out of survival. At 9:15 a.m. his phone rang again. Detective O'Neill. "Mr. Whitman, I have an update for you." He straightened in his chair. "Yes, go ahead." "I requested your bank's digital logs last night. Transaction metadata, device signatures, access points. The bank expedited them because of the size of the fraud." George felt something twist in his gut, and they also ran a trace on the online authorization attempts, she continued. Tone steady but firm. The system captured the IP addresses used during the booking window. George gripped the edge of the table. Where did they lead? "Your son's residence." The word struck like a blunt object, solid, irreversible. Detective O'Neill added, "The transactions weren't made on a public network or some foreign server. They originated from the home Wi-Fi registered under Eric Whitman." Silence filled the line. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a stolen password. It was Harold clicking buttons while Eric stood clueless nearby. It was Eric's house. Eric's network. Eric's access. George swallowed hard, but his throat felt like sandpaper. "So you're certain?" "There's no doubt," O'Neill said. "We have the timestamps, the IP match, and the device trail. It wasn't accidental." He closed his eyes and the room tilted slightly, not enough to make him fall, but enough to feel unsteady. He had hoped, quietly and foolishly, that the digital trail would reveal something else, anything else, that maybe the son he raised wasn't capable of this level of betrayal. But the evidence didn't lie. "What happens next?" he whispered. "We continue building the case," she said. "I'll need any communication from him. Texts, calls, emails, anything showing intent, pressure, or admission." George glanced at the folder he'd created. "I have plenty." "Good," she replied. "Stay steady, Mr. Whitman. This is a painful process, but it's necessary." After she hung up, George sat completely still, letting the truth settle into the room like dust that would never be swept away. His hands shook not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just been confirmed. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overreacting. His son, his only son, had deliberately used his accounts to fund a luxury overseas trip. He opened Eric's messages again. More had come in while he was on the call. "Dad, please answer. I didn't know it would get this bad. I panicked. Please don't hate me." George rubbed his temples. Hate was the wrong word. He didn't hate Eric. He hated what Eric had become. He hated what desperation and pride had carved out of him. He hated the role Harold and Lindsay played in feeding it, but none of that excused what the bank logs had proven. He stood and walked to the window, watching the quiet street, the soft sway of tree branches in the breeze. His life had always been simple, steady, predictable. Now everything felt fractured, and the person who broke it was someone he'd once carried on his shoulders. He breathed slowly, in through his nose, out through his mouth, trying to gather himself. There was no turning back now. No pretending this was a misunderstanding. No hoping this would resolve quietly. The next step would be harder, colder, necessary. And as he stood there, phone buzzing again with another desperate message from Eric, George realized he wasn't preparing for confrontation anymore. He was preparing for something far more painful and far more final. George had never tracked a flight in his life, but over the next 48 hours, he checked the airline app more than 100 times. He watched the itinerary he hadn't booked, the one he never agreed to pay for, update itself line by line. When the system registered the freeze, the screen refreshed with a small, almost satisfying note beside each ticket. Class downgraded, business right arrow economy. Eric's name. Lindsay's name. Harold's name. All three pushed down into the cramped rows at the back of the plane, where their drinks wouldn't be poured into crystal glasses and the seats wouldn't unfold into beds. Their digital humiliation mirrored the moral one he had endured, and he felt no guilt for it. He noticed something else too, the silence. Eric, who posted every vacation picture, every happy moment, every forced success, said nothing. Lindsay, who curated her life like a brand, locked her account completely. Harold, who loved an audience, went dark. Silence often told the truth louder than noise. On the morning of their return, George woke early, put on a clean sweater, and drove to the airport, not because he wanted to welcome them home, but because he needed to see their faces. He needed to look directly at the people who had treated him like a blank check. O'Hare Airport buzzed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases, tired families, overhead announcements swallowing every other sound. George stood near the arrival's gate, hands in his pockets, watching passengers emerge through the sliding doors with that familiar post-flight exhaustion. He scanned the crowd patiently. A couple walked through, dragging matching luggage. A businessman checked his watch and jogged past. A young woman hugged her parents, crying with relief. Then he saw them. Not all at once, but in pieces. First the shuffle of Harold's unmistakable designer luggage, then Lindsay's stiff posture, then, finally, Eric, shoulders slumped, looking smaller than George had ever seen him. Their clothes air wrinkled, their hair disheveled, their faces tight with frustration and travel fatigue. Eric spotted George first. His eyes widened, and for a second, shame flickered across his face. Real shame, not the manufactured kind he used when trying to talk himself out of trouble. "Dad," he murmured, voice rough. Lindsay looked away immediately as if the sight of George personally offended her. Harold, however, stopped walking altogether. His face turned a violent shade of red. You, he snapped, pointing a trembling hand at George. You embarrassed me, internationally. People nearby turned to look. George remained completely still. Harold continued, do you have any idea what it's like to be downgraded on a 13-hour flight? They stuck us between crying babies and some teenager who kept kicking my seat. I couldn't even access the lounge. We had to pay for water on the plane like peasants. George blinked slowly. I didn't steal $80,000. The words hung in the air, simple, calm, immovable. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His outrage found no place to land. Lindsay stepped in, her voice tight with irritation rather than remorse. George, you really didn't have to show up here. This has been stressful for all of us. George tilted his head slightly. Stressful. Eric flinched. You drained my accounts, George said softly. Then you went on vacation using my money, and now you're stressed. Eric looked down at the floor like the tiles suddenly fascinated him. Harold scoffed. Oh, please, it's not like you needed all that money anyway. You're an old man living alone. Harold, Lindsay hissed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The insult lingered, sharp and thoughtless. George didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, didn't flinch. He simply turned his gaze to Eric, the only person whose response mattered. Is that how you see me too? He asked quietly. Old, alone, and easy to take from. Eric's lips parted but no sound came out. Not denial, not apology, not explanation. Just silence. A silence that confessed more than any words could. George watched his son's face, searching for anything, remorse, regret, realization. Instead, he found nothing but a boy who'd been caught, not a man who understood what he'd done. Harold muttered under his breath about ungrateful elders, while Lindsay checked her phone like she was late for a spa appointment. Eric seemed frozen in place, unable to meet his father's eyes. George stepped back, putting space between them, not physically but symbolically. The gap that had always been emotional now existed in plain sight. Get home safe, George said finally, voice steady. We'll talk when I'm ready. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the stunned trio, their expensive luggage, their ruined pride. And though he didn't see their reactions, he didn't need to. He felt the shift the moment he walked through the automatic doors into the cool Chicago air. For the first time since this began, Eric wasn't the one in control. George was. And the next step, the one he'd been avoiding, was coming whether his son was ready or not. George didn't go straight inside when he got home. He sat in the car for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, the silence thick and unmoving. The airport confrontation replayed in his mind, not the yelling, not Harold's tantrum, not Lindsay's irritation. What lingered was Eric's silence. His son had looked at him like a man caught in headlights, frozen between guilt and pride, unable to choose which one to show. George finally stepped out, walked into the house, and barely made it to the kitchen before his phone lit up again. Eric calling. He let it ring twice, then answered. Dad, Eric said immediately, voice cracking with desperation, please don't do this. Don't report anything. We can fix it. We can make this go away. George leaned against the counter. I didn't do anything, Eric, you did. Dad, I messed up. I know I did. But if you press charges, my job, my reputation, my life, it'll all be gone, please. George closed his eyes. Eric, you deliberately used my card. You drained my savings. You booked an international luxury trip behind my back, and you ignored every call I made. It wasn't like that, Eric snapped. Harold said. I don't care what Harold said, George interrupted quietly. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by a brittle exhale from Eric. Then just give me a chance to explain. I'll pay you back, I swear. Just don't get the police involved. George almost laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. Pay him back. Eric couldn't even cover his mortgage without panic. $80,000 wasn't something he'd just hand over. Before George could respond, he heard another voice in the background, sharp, irritated. "Lindsay." "Put me on speaker," she ordered. There was a shuffle, and suddenly her voice came through clearly. "George, this has gone far enough. You need to act like family." George's jaw clenched. "Family, that's what you call this?" "Yes," she said, sounding offended he'd even question it. "Families help each other. Families sacrifice. Families don't call the police over misunderstandings." "This wasn't a misunderstanding," George replied. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you planned that trip." "Oh, please," Lindsay scoffed. "You barely use that money. You live alone. You could have been generous for once." Eric was finally showing leadership, trying to contribute to something bigger. George felt something inside him shift, anger, quiet but firm. "Family doesn't empty my account." There was silence for a full second, heavy and sharp. Then Eric's voice exploded through the speaker. "You know what? If you go through with this, I'm done. Don't expect us to call. Don't expect visits. Don't expect anything. You'll be alone, completely alone." George stared at the wall in front of him, at the framed picture of his late wife resting on the shelf. Alone. That word didn't carry the threat Eric thought it did. He'd already lived through real loneliness, the kind that comes from losing someone irreplaceable. Whatever Eric was threatening felt small in comparison. "You need to do what you think is best," George said quietly. "Seriously," Eric shouted. "You ruin your own son's life over some money." "It wasn't some money," George said. His voice was steady. "It was trust." Another silence led the call, wounded, angry, trembling. Then, without another word, the line went dead. George didn't collapse, didn't cry, didn't pace the floor in anger. He simply set the phone down gently, like he was placing the final piece in a puzzle he never wanted to solve. Half an hour later, his phone buzzed again. "Detective O'Neill." George answered, "Yes, detective." "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice firm, "the bank and our team have completed preliminary classification. Your case is now officially labeled as family-facilitated fraud. That means the perpetrator is not an unknown external actor. It is someone with personal access or shared proximity." George exhaled, a long, exhausted breath. "I understand." "I'll need all the documentation you mentioned," O'Neill continued. "The screenshots, the itinerary with your card number, the messages from your son, everything." He looked at the folder on his phone, the one he had built meticulously over days that felt like years. "I have it ready." "Bring it by the station tomorrow morning," she said, "and be prepared for the next steps. This won't be easy." "I know," George replied. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if anyone could truly prepare for something like this. Turning in his own son, handing authorities the proof that his family had betrayed him down to the bone. After hanging up, George sat at the kitchen table, the evening light stretching across the floor in long shadows. Shadows that reached him. Shadows he didn't bother stepping away from. The betrayal was no longer private. No longer a suspicion. No longer just an emotional wound. It was official. Documented. Recorded. Real. And tomorrow, the world outside his house would recognize it too. The next chapter of this break wasn't going to be quiet, and deep down, George knew. The storm was only beginning to take shape. George arrived at the precinct the next morning with a manila folder tucked under his arm. He had slept only in fragments, his mind cycling through Eric's threats, Lindsay's contempt, and Harold's self-pity. But by sunrise, exhaustion had hardened into something steadier. Not anger, not even sorrow. Resolve. Detective O'Neill met him in her office, a small, functional space crowded with binders, case files, and a faint smell of strong coffee. She gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Whitman," she began, sliding a stack of printed documents onto her desk. "I need you to brace yourself. We've uncovered more." George's stomach tightened. He had thought he was braced. He had thought nothing could surprise him now. He was wrong. O'Neill tapped the top sheet. "Yesterday, after classifying your case, we ran a deeper audit of your financial footprint, standard procedure in large-scale family fraud. During that pull, the system flagged an application submitted 2 weeks ago." George frowned. "An application for what?" "A new credit line," she said, "in your name." The word struck clean through him. He blinked once, twice. "I never applied for any new credit." "I know," O'Neill said calmly. "That's why it was flagged." She slid a page toward him. George recognized his own personal information instantly. His birth date, his address, even his social security number typed neatly into the form. But the signature wasn't his. Someone had tried to mimic the shaky slope of his handwriting and failed. His pulse thudded in his ears. Who submitted this? "We traced the IP address," O'Neill said, opening a second file. "It originated from the same home network as the Dubai charges." "Eric's house." George stared at the paper. It felt unreal, like a bad dream too detailed to be dismissed. But she wasn't finished. "There's more," she continued, sliding forward another sheet. "A second device was involved. Different browser signature, different user profile." George looked up slowly. "Who?" "The forensic team identified it as Lindsay Whitman's laptop." For a moment, George didn't breathe. He felt as if the room sank an inch around him. Eric and Lindsay hadn't just spent his money. They had planned for more. They had tried to open new lines of credit to take even more from him. They were actively expanding the fraud even before they boarded the Dubai flight. Detective O'Neill leaned back, her expression steady but sympathetic. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was coordinated. George's hands trembled barely, but enough for him to clasp them together to hide it. Why? Why would they need another credit line? O'Neill hesitated, then spoke with blunt clarity. Harold Kemp told an acquaintance, who posted publicly, that he was expecting an additional $30,000 on the Dubai trip. Apparently he believed your son was handling it. The room tilted again. Harold expecting $30,000 more. Planned fraud escalation. Not just theft, but a blueprint of how to bleed him dry. George leaned back, palms pressed against his thighs. "They were going to take more," he whispered. "Even more." "Yes, Oni," LL said softly, "and they would have if the bank hadn't flagged it." He closed his eyes for a long moment. He had spent years believing Eric's worst flaw was immaturity, poor decisions, weak boundaries, bad influence from Lindsay, but this wasn't immaturity. This was orchestration. As if on cue, the detective cleared her throat. "Given the scale of this, you need legal representation, someone who specializes in financial restitution." "I know an attorney," George murmured. "She handled my estate after my wife passed." "Call her," O'Neill said. "This has moved beyond a simple family dispute. You're within your rights to pursue both civil and criminal action." George nodded slowly. "I will." He left the precinct with the folder heavy in his hands, the cold November wind hitting his face as if trying to snap him into clarity. He dialed attorney Sheila Barnes before reaching his car. She answered on the first ring. "George, are you all right?" He described everything, every charge, every log, every IP match, every new credit line. Sheila listened without interrupting, her silence more comforting than any attempt to soothe. When he finished, she exhaled sharply. "George, this isn't just fraud. This is a deliberate, systematic exploitation of an elder's finances." "Yes," he said quietly, "I know. You need to file civil claims immediately. And criminal charges are not only justified, they're necessary. If you don't act, they could try again." George looked down at the stack of evidence in his hand. His son's handwriting, his daughter-in-law's IP signature, Harold's entitlement. A family he thought he could bend for had been sharpening knives behind his back. "George," Sheila continued, her voice low but firm, "tell me exactly what you want to do." He looked at the parking lot, the gray sky, the world that suddenly felt sharper, colder. And then he spoke, almost in a whisper. "I'm done protecting him." The words tasted bitter, but right, necessary. "Good," Sheila said, "then let's begin." George ended the call and sat in the driver's seat without turning on the engine. His breath fogged the windshield, the silence thick around him. This wasn't vengeance, not the loud, reckless kind. This was reclamation, the first clean step in taking back his dignity. And deep in his chest, beneath the grief and exhaustion, something steady ignited. A quiet beginning to the revenge he never imagined he'd have to pursue. The next week unfolded like a slow, deliberate tightening of a net, every thread pulled with intention, every knot secured by people who understood exactly what George was up against. There was no adrenaline now, no frantic shock, just steady steps, one after another as the truth took a more formal shape. Sheila Barnes met George in her downtown office on Monday morning. Her conference table was already covered with documents, drafts of civil suits, spreadsheets of damages, and a neat outline of the legal strategy she intended to pursue. "George," she said, sliding a folder toward him, "this is the civil claim against Eric. It covers the unauthorized charges, attempted credit line fraud, and elder financial exploitation." George nodded. Sheila continued. "Here's the civil action against Lindsay. She participated directly, and the digital logs make that impossible to deny." George skimmed the papers, his name at the top, theirs listed below like strangers, not family. Seeing it in writing felt surreal, painful, but also clarifying. "This is what accountability looks like," Sheila said gently. "Not revenge, protection." He signed where she indicated, his pen steady, no hesitation. On Tuesday, Detective O'Neill called him back to the precinct. She wore the same calm expression as before, but today she had a thick binder in her hands. "This," she said, placing it on the table, "is the criminal case file. Fraud, unauthorized card use, identity misuse, and attempted credit expansion. We'll be forwarding it to the county prosecutor by the end of the week." George's breath caught slightly. "It's really happening." "It needs to," O'Neill replied. "They didn't just overspend, they built a scheme around you. If we don't act now, it could escalate again." She wasn't dramatic. She didn't soften her words. She was simply stating fact, and that steadiness helped George breathe. Later that afternoon, as part of the process, he returned to the bank to meet with Tyler. The young banker greeted him with a firm handshake, his expression a blend of sympathy and professionalism. "I've compiled the documentation Detective O'Neill asked for," Tyler said, tapping his tablet. "Every fraudulent attempt, every rejected transaction, every location ping. I've also included the timeline of the freeze so investigators can map it to their travel." George looked at him with genuine gratitude. "You've done more for me than you know." Tyler shook his head. "I'm just doing my job, but I'm glad you fought back. Most people would have let fear stop them." Geo. RGE tucked the printed reports into his folder, feeling the weight of preparation settling into his bones. Not a burden, armor. That evening he sat at his dining table, the overhead light glowing softly on a different set of papers, his will. The last time he'd opened the binder was after his wife died. Back then, updating it felt like honoring her, protecting the family they'd built. Now it felt like closing a door. He read through the clauses carefully. Eric had once been the primary beneficiary, house, savings, a lifetime of careful planning. But those decisions were made in years when trust was unquestioned. He picked up his pen slowly. He crossed Eric's name out. The ink felt strangely final. He didn't remove him out of spite. He removed him because he had to. Because a man who would clone his father's card at midnight and lie through his teeth about it shouldn't control the legacy his wife helped build. When he finished, he closed the binder with a quiet exhale. A soft knock sounded at the door a few minutes later. It was Janice. She carried 2 mugs of tea and her familiar knitted scarf wrapped around her shoulders, the same one she wore whenever she sensed something was wrong. "I figured you could use company," she said. George smiled faintly. "It's been a lot." Janice sat across from him, noticing the will on the table but not prying. "You're doing the right thing," she said gently. "I know it doesn't feel good, but righteous choices rarely do." He looked down at his hands. "I keep wondering if I should have seen the signs, if I failed him somehow." "George," she said softly, "bad people make bad choices. Good people suffer from them. That doesn't make the good people responsible." Her words settled into him like warm stones, heavy, grounding, strangely comforting. But the quiet didn't last. His phone buzzed, then again and again. "Eric." More messages. "Dad, please answer. I'm scared. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please don't involve the courts. I'll pay you back, just stop this." George read each one, his expression unreadable. These weren't confessions. They were fear-filled negotiations, desperate attempts to rewrite what had already happened. He didn't respond. Instead, he saved every message, dragging them into the evidence folder, another thread in the tightening net. Janice watched him quietly. "You're preparing." "Yes," he said. "How do you feel?" George looked at the folder, the will, the suit drafts, the printed logs. Then he whispered the only honest answer. "Ready." Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, carrying the weight of everything still ahead. This wasn't the end. It was the moment before the real confrontation began. News spreads fast in a small community, faster than truth, faster than apologies, faster than a guilty son scrambling to stay ahead of consequences. George didn't have to make any announcements. He didn't have to tell a soul what Eric and Lindsay had done. The investigation itself did the talking, quietly slipping into the places where reputations were built and broken. It began on a Tuesday morning. George was sipping coffee when his phone buzzed, not with a message from Eric, but from a mutual acquaintance who worked at Eric's construction firm. The text was short. "George, I'm sorry. Eric's corporate card was frozen today. HR said it's tied to a fraud investigation. He's in trouble." George closed the message slowly. He hadn't wanted things to spiral into Eric's work life, not directly. But actions had consequences, and Eric's choices had finally reached farther than his father's wallet. Later that day, he learned what happened. Eric had tried using his company's card for a basic lunch order, and the system flagged him. By the end of the hour, HR had called him in. Rumors spread through the office like wildfire. Someone said fraud. Someone else said misuse. Another whispered police involved. Not one of those rumors worked in Eric's favor. George felt a pulse of sadness, deep, old, paternal, but he didn't intervene. He couldn't. Meanwhile, Harold, who had been roaring loudly only days earlier, suddenly shifted his tone. Overnight, he washed his hands of the entire situation. He started telling his social circle that he had no idea where the Dubai money came from, that Eric had misrepresented everything, that Lindsay's family couldn't be blamed for another household's dysfunction. People had already seen the chaotic mid-flight video Harold posted. They'd seen him brag, demand upgrades, pose with champagne. Now he pretended he had simply been an innocent passenger blindsided by financial turbulence. George saw a screenshot someone forwarded him from a community Facebook group, Harold commenting, "We trusted Eric. He lied to us all." George didn't reply, didn't correct him, didn't even feel the need to. The truth no longer required his voice. Lindsay, meanwhile, acted as if online theatrics could erase the facts. Her Instagram, once locked after the Dubai meltdown, reopened with a parade of vague, passive-aggressive quotes laid over soft pastel backgrounds. Blood doesn't make family, loyalty does. Some parents just don't want their kids to succeed. Protect your energy from toxic elders. George saw them only because friends sent screenshots. He never checked her page himself. The performative victimhood didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how hollow the words felt now. Once upon a time, they might have stung. Now, they barely registered. George had chosen silence, not because he lacked something to say, but because silence, in moments like this, was power. Noise belonged to the guilty. Sheila, meanwhile, stayed focused and sharp. She filed a formal petition for a financial protection order, ensuring Eric couldn't access anything tied to George. No accounts, no credit, no shared information, not even emergency access. "Your assets are now legally shielded," she said during their follow-up meeting. "If they try anything else, even indirectly, it'll trigger an automatic violation." George nodded, relief threading gently through the exhaustion. But he could feel the community shifting. Whispers followed him at the grocery store, gentle murmurs that paused when he walked past. Neighbors talked in low voices on their porches. The cashier gave him a sympathetic look he didn't ask for. Everyone knew something had happened. They didn't know details, but the shape of the story was clear enough. A man betrayed by his own son. A family fractured publicly. A scandal that cracked open the polished exterior. Eric and Lindsay worked so hard to maintain. If there was embarrassment, it was George's. He carried himself with the same steady posture he'd always had, calm, polite, soft-spoken. He didn't answer questions. He didn't defend himself. He didn't justify. The people who mattered already knew the truth. The rest would learn in time. Later that evening, he sat on his porch, wrapped in a light jacket against the cool air. The street was quiet. Leaves rustled across the pavement, carried by a slow breeze. The sky dimmed from gold to blue. George took in the stillness. It felt grounding. Everything around him was swirling. Legal battles, public embarrassment, family denial. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt since the first charge appeared on his bank statement. Steadiness. He couldn't control the whispers. He couldn't control the fallout. He couldn't control Eric's spiral, or Lindsay's theatrics, or Harold's cowardice. But he could control himself. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the day settle but not crush. The storm was still forming. There were courtroom days ahead. Confrontations he couldn't avoid. Decisions heavier than anything he'd ever faced. But he was ready. His phone buzzed on the small table beside him. Another message, another ripple in the growing aftermath. He reached for it, steady as ever. The courthouse in downtown Cleveland had always looked imposing to George, with its cold stone pillars and tall, narrow windows that made the building resemble a monument to hard truths. On the morning of the hearing, it felt even heavier, like every mile of betrayal that brought him here had gathered in the walls, waiting for this moment. George arrived early with Sheila, who briefed him once more on procedure, tone, expectations. He listened, nodded, answered when needed, but most of his attention was inward, steadying himself for whatever he was about to see. When the courtroom doors finally opened and the small crowd trickled inside, George felt his breath catch, not sharply, but in a slow, resigned way. Eric was already there. His son stood near the defendant's table with shoulders hunched, suit wrinkled, tie crooked as if he'd put it on in the parking lot. His eyes darted around the room, wide with fear. He looked smaller than the grown man George had raised, almost like a boy waiting for punishment he couldn't outrun. Lindsay stood next to him, pale and stiff. Her usual confidence had drained into something more jagged. Her jaw clenched, her arms crossed, her gaze flicked angrily from person to person, as if searching for someone to blame. That familiar superiority was gone. What replaced it was raw panic thinly disguised as indignation. George took a seat beside Sheila, deliberately avoiding Eric's eyes. He had rehearsed this part in his mind. No emotional collapse, no confrontation, no last-minute rescue. He would be present but not available, strong but not cruel. Detective O'Neill entered moments later, carrying a thick evidence binder. She greeted George with a respectful nod before taking her place at the prosecutor's table. The judge, a stern woman with sharp glasses and a voice that filled the room with quiet authority, called the session to order. The rustling stopped. The whispers died. Even Lindsay straightened in her seat. State of Ohio versus Eric Whitman and Lindsay Whitman, the judge announced. Hearing their names listed that way, no family, no son, sent a hollow ache through George's chest, but he stayed still. O'Neill stood first. Your Honor, the state will demonstrate that the defendants engaged in coordinated financial fraud targeting Mr. George Whitman, age 72, through unauthorized card use, cross-border charges, and attempted identity misuse for the purpose of securing additional credit. She moved methodically, laying out the facts with clarity and precision. First came the bank statements showing the $80,000 in charges, then the timeline of the Dubai bookings, then the decline logs from the mid-flight freeze. But it was when she opened the digital authentication file that the room shifted. These IP logs, she said, holding the binder upright, show the origin of every online attempt made using Mr. Whitman's identity. The addresses trace back to the defendant's residence. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lindsay's face drained of color. Eric bowed his head. George didn't look at them. O'Neill continued. Additionally, we have text messages from Mr. Eric Whitman acknowledging involvement, messages Mr. Whitman saved as documentation. She read them aloud, every attempt to blame Harold, every excuse, every panicked admission. Eric visibly winced with each one. When O'Neill finished, the judge turned to the defendants. Do either of you wish to make a statement? Eric stepped forward before Lindsay could stop him. Your Honor, he said, voice trembling, this wasn't all me. Harold pressured us. He told me I needed to look suck. Esful, that Lindsay's family had expectations. I didn't think, he swallowed. I didn't think Dad would react like this. Harold said he'd help cover it. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is Harold Kemp a cosigner on your father's accounts? Eric blinked. No. Did he have legal access to your father's identity? No. Did he force you to use your father's information? Eric hesitated, searching for footing that wasn't there. No, not directly. The judge nodded once, unimpressed. Then Mr. Kemp's opinions, however misguided, are irrelevant to the actions you took. Eric's shoulders slumped. Next, the judge turned to Lindsay. Mrs. Whitman, do you have anything to add? Lindsay stood, anger flashing behind her eyes. We didn't intend to hurt anyone. George lives simply. He doesn't need all that money. And Eric was trying to. That's enough, the judge cut in. Need does not negate theft, and intent does not excuse fraud. Lindsay sat heavily, face flushed with humiliation. Through all of it, George kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't let his eyes drift toward his son, not because he felt nothing, but because feeling too much might break the composure he'd spent weeks building. The judge closed the evidence file and folded her hands. Given the volume of documentation, the cross-verification of digital trails, and the defendant's partial admissions, the court will move this case to restitution hearings. Lindsay exhaled sharply, understanding the implication. Eric looked like his knees might give out. The judge continued, the state will prepare a full financial recovery plan for Mr. Whitman. Hearings will be scheduled in the coming weeks. She struck her gavel. Court adjourned. People began filing out, whispering, shuffling, adjusting jackets and purses. George stood slowly. Eric looked up at him across the room, eyes glassy, pleading. George didn't meet his gaze. He followed Sheila toward the exit, feeling the weight of what had just unfolded, but also the steady certainty of forward motion. Behind him, Lindsay whispered fiercely to Eric, her voice taut with fear. "We might lose everything, Eric, everything." George didn't turn around. The next step had been set in motion. Restitution. Accountability. Truth now written into the court record. And the road ahead was only getting narrower. The weeks following the court hearing unfolded like a slow-motion collapse, each day peeling back another layer of the fragile image Eric and Lindsay had spent years polishing. It didn't happen privately either. Their unraveling was loud, public, and impossible to hide. It started with an argument in the parking lot of their upscale grocery store. Someone filmed it on their phone and posted it online. The video wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Eric stood beside their car, his voice breaking as he tried to reason with Lindsay. She shoved a reusable bag at him, furious, shouting something about him ruining everything. He reached for her arm. She pulled away like his touch burned. Within hours, the clip spread around the neighborhood. George received it 3 times from 3 different people. He watched it only once. A few days later, another story spread, this time from the restaurant where Lindsay worked part-time for extra income. She'd come in red-eyed, mascara streaked, and told her coworkers she couldn't trust Eric anymore, that he had put her entire future at risk. Her coworkers listened, but no one comforted her. The scandal had exhausted their sympathy. Then Harold started chiming in. He didn't call George, he didn't dare, but he did start making comments in his golf club's lounge. Loudly, carelessly, mockingly. "Imagine," Harold boasted to his friends, drink in hand, "raising a son so clueless he can't even manage wealth properly. If he'd listened to me, none of this would have happened. I gave him a blueprint. He botched it." Someone recorded that too. George didn't bother listening. The transcript alone was enough to sour his stomach. Meanwhile, Eric's life began to crumble at the edges. His company, already unsettled by the fraud investigation, placed him on unpaid leave. Friends stopped responding to his texts. Lindsay's family, once eager to parade him around as proof of their influence, stopped inviting him to anything. Even the neighbors who once waved at him now shut their blinds when he walked by. It wasn't long before Eric reached out again. George's phone buzzed on a quiet afternoon. He was sweeping the back porch when he heard the vibration. He expected another update from Sheila or O'Neill. Instead, it was Eric. The message read, "Dad, please, I need help just this once. Not for the case, just to survive, alone, anything." There was no apology attached to it, no acknowledgement of what he'd done, only need, only desperation. George wiped his hands on his jeans, then texted back with deliberate calm. "Eric, I can't do that." Seconds later, another message came. "You won't help your own son. After everything I've done for this family." George shut his eyes for a moment, sadness folding over him like a heavy blanket. Then he responded, "Eric, helping you is not the same as enabling you. I won't fund the consequences you created." Eric didn't reply immediately, but an hour later, a long message arrived, angry, rambling, filled with accusations about loyalty, family, and abandonment. George didn't argue. He saved the message in the evidence folder and set the phone aside. Lindsay, however, didn't stay quiet. She posted a cryptic quote on Instagram, another pastel square with a sharp edge. "Sometimes the biggest betrayal comes from the person who raised you." George didn't dignify it with thought. But 2 days later, the real shift happened. Lindsay moved out. George heard the news indirectly, from Janice, who had overheard 2 neighbors talking near the mailbox cluster. "She packed bags, 2 suitcases," one had whispered. Left right before noon, didn't even wait for Eric to get home. She went to her mother S, the other said. Said she couldn't stay with someone dragging her future into the ground. George listened quietly as Janice relayed the whispers. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't take pleasure in their collapse. He simply nodded, absorbing the inevitability of it all. That evening, Eric texted again, short, sharp, and heartbroken. She left me. She said I ruined her life. Dad, I'm losing everything. George stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down without replying. Loss was the cost of choices, and Eric had made plenty. In the days that followed, Eric's appearance changed. He stopped shaving. He started wearing the same jacket, frayed, worn over and over. He looked thinner, older, hollowed out by consequences he had once believed he'd avoid through charm and excuses. Meanwhile, George remained steady. He kept his routines, tended his yard, drank morning coffee on the porch. He met with Sheila and O'Neill for updates. He stayed polite, composed, and quiet in the face of gossip. And through it all, he felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not vindication, but certainty. The countermove was complete. Eric had set the fire. Lindsay had fanned it. Harold had pushed them forward. Now the flames were circling back, burning exactly where they began. And George, the man they thought would fold, remained standing. Steady, silent, unmoved, because the real reckoning was still ahead. The morning of the follow-up hearing arrived cold and metallic, the sky hanging low over Cleveland like a sheet of brushed steel. George drove to the courthouse in silence, the wipers dragging slowly across the windshield as a light drizzle tapped out a restless rhythm. He wasn't nervous, not anymore. He wasn't angry either. What he felt was harder to name, something that sat deeper than emotion. A kind of weary resolve, the acceptance that whatever happened today would close one chapter and force open another. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with muted conversations. Attorneys shuffled through stacks of paper. Clerks hurried between rooms. George found his seat beside Sheila, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Whatever comes out today," she whispered, "you're ready." He hoped she was right. Detective O'Neill entered moments later, holding a new binder, thicker than before, packed with pages that hadn't existed at the previous hearing. Her expression told George something had shifted, something big. Eric and Lindsay arrived next. Eric looked worse than before, eyes swollen, posture bent, his suit hanging off him like a borrowed costume. Lindsay, on the other hand, walked stiffly, chin high, an icy determination in her face. But there was something else there too, something tight around her mouth, something that looked almost like fear. Harold trailed behind them. He kept a careful distance as if proximity alone might implicate him. His sunglasses, worn indoors, did nothing to hide his unease. When the judge took her seat, the courtroom fell into a hush. "Detective O'Neill," the judge said, "you indicated you have new findings to present." O'Neill rose. "Yes, Your Honor, findings that significantly expand the scope of the case." George's stomach tightened. She began by opening the binder and pulling out a sequence of printed screenshots. In addition to confirming that the unauthorized Dubai charges were executed from the defendant's home network, she said, "Our cyber team recovered deleted communications from devices at the Whitman residence." Lindsay's head jerked slightly. Eric's breath hitched. O'Neill continued, "These communications include planning messages, instructions, file transfers, and most critically, evidence that the cloning of Mr. Whitman's card was not spontaneous." The room shifted, chairs creaked, whispers fluttered. "It was orchestrated," O'Neill said. Her eyes moved toward Lindsay, direct, unwavering, and orchestrated by Mrs. Lindsay Whitman. Lindsay's face dropped. "In net of color, that is absolutely false." But O'Neill didn't pause. She pulled out a sequence of emails. "These are from an encrypted account linked to your device, drafted, sent, and deleted between late September and early October. They include a step-by-step breakdown of how to capture Mr. Whitman's card information. They also reference coordinating the Dubai repayment plan with your father. Harold stiffened. O'Neill flipped to another page. Furthermore, digital forensic analysis revealed that the applications for new credit lines, initially thought to be Eric's doing, contained a forged digital signature. The forging tool was accessed under Mrs. Whitman's user profile. The stylus imprint data matches her device. George closed his eyes. Forged signatures, loan applications, orchestration. His heart sank lower than he thought possible. Eric's shoulders began to shake. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitman, do you wish to respond?" Lindsay swallowed hard. "Your Honor, I didn't. This is a misunderstanding. I only helped with paperwork because Eric—" "No," Eric whispered. Lindsay whipped toward him. "Eric, don't." But something inside Eric broke open. All the pressure, all the fear, all the guilt he had tried to redirect it collapsed at once. He stood, voice trembling as he addressed the judge. "She planned it," he said. "Everything. She said her dad needed the Dubai trip as repayment for a family loan, and we'd look like failures if we didn't deliver. She told me Dad would never know. She told me to do it." The courtroom fell silent. Eric wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I did what she said. I cloned the card. I booked the trip. I used Dad's information. And I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to tell her no." Lindsay gasped, betrayed. "Eric." He kept talking, voice breaking apart. "I'm responsible for what I did. I know that now, but I didn't start it. I didn't plan it. I just followed her. And it ruined everything." George watched, heart heavy, not with rage this time, but with a grief so deep it almost felt physical. This was the son he'd raised, the boy he'd tried so hard to guide, and here he was, unraveling in front of strangers in a courtroom. The judge called for order. Detective O'Neill spoke again. "Based on these findings, the state is filing additional charges against Mrs. Whitman for fraud coordination, digital forgery, and identity manipulation. Given Mr. Harold Kemp's involvement, we are issuing a subpoena for his testimony regarding the so-called family loan and his knowledge of the scheme." Harold's face twisted. "This is absurd." But the judge silenced him with a single stern glance. Then she turned toward George. "Mr. Whitman, please stand." George rose slowly. "Given the overwhelming evidence, the state's recommendation, and the defendant's own admissions," the judge said, "the court is granting full restitution. Every dollar taken from you will be repaid through garnished wages and legally enforced repayment plans." George nodded, unable to speak. The judge concluded, "This court recognizes the emotional weight of this case, and today we restore what was taken." Her gavel struck. As people began to move, Eric sank into his chair, head in his hands. Lindsay stared forward, stunned and silent. Harold cursed under his breath as an officer approached with the subpoena. George didn't look at any of them. He turned toward the courtroom doors, each step steady, each breath deep. The truth had finally come out, ugly, twisted, undeniable. Heartbroken, yes, but resolute. This chapter was closing. And the path ahead, recovery, restitution, reckoning, was now officially underway. The first restitution payment arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no fanfare, no apology, no explanation. Just a line item on an official notice. Wage garnishment initiated, Eric Whitman. The amount wasn't huge, not compared to what had been taken, but it was the first real sign that the wheel of justice was turning. Slow, steady, irreversible. George held the paper for a long moment, exhaling through his nose as he set it on the kitchen table. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just confirmation. The world had tilted off its axis for months, but now, at last, something was shifting back into place. Sheila called that afternoon. The protection order is finalized, she said. No financial interaction, no joint accounts, no access to anything tied to your identity. You're shielded from any further attempts. Thank you, George said, and he meant it. Sheila had carried him through this storm with steadiness he didn't know he needed. It's more than protection, she added. It's closure. The courts recognize what happened to you. That matters. It did, more than he expected. Later that week, another call came, this time from Detective O'Neill. Her voice was calm, the warmth in it almost surprising given the path they'd walked together. Mr. Whitman, I wanted to let you know that, due to the coordinated nature of the fraud, Eric has been ordered into mandatory counseling as part of the resolution plan. George paused, processing. Counseling. It's standard in cases involving family exploitation, she said. It's meant to break cycles, financial, emotional, behavioral. It doesn't erase what he did, but it may help him understand why he did it. George ran a hand over his face. He's struggling, isn't he? He lost his job, O'Neill said gently. Between the company investigation and the court record, he wasn't in a position to stay, but he's complying with the court's orders. That's something. George nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Thank you for telling me. It didn't comfort him, not exactly, but it didn't hurt either. It simply was another piece of the aftermath falling into place. That evening, he reopened the will he had updated weeks earlier, the one where he'd crossed out Eric's name. It lay on the table like a symbolic break, a line drawn straight through his son's future. Now, with restitution underway and counseling mandated, he took a pen and didn't write Eric back in, but he made a small note in the margin. To be reconsidered in the future, pending trust rebuilt. Not forgiveness. Not restoration. Just possibility. A door cracked open, not fully, but enough that one day, maybe, things might look different. Janice came by the next morning with a stack of paint swatches in her hand. You need a change, she said, stepping into his living room as if the decision had already been made. Your house has held too much stress lately. Let's clear it out. George laughed, an honest, surprised sound. Paint, you want to paint? Yes, she said firmly. Colors change energy, and your house needs new energy. He didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe repainting wasn't just cosmetic, it was symbolic. They spent the weekend moving furniture, covering floors in plastic sheets, and brushing warm, earthy tones across the walls. Janice insisted he pick the colors himself, but she guided him, nudging him away from the muted grays he almost chose. Soft greens, she said, peaceful, restorative, you need that. By Sunday evening, the house felt different, lighter, warmer, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. On Monday morning, George did something he hadn't done in months. He took a long walk through the neighborhood, breathing in the crisp air, letting the steady rhythm of his steps loosen something inside him. He passed dog walkers, teenagers heading to school, older couples tending to gardens. No one whispered. No one stared. Life was moving on. He stopped at the small community park and sat on a bench beneath a maple tree just beginning to turn gold. For the first time since this ordeal began, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It wasn't waiting for another shoe to drop. It was peaceful. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs until it pushed out the residue of anger and humiliation he'd carried for so long. Healing wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived slowly, through a letter in the mail, a paintbrush dragged across a wall, a walk around a familiar block that suddenly felt safe again. When he returned home, the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting warm stripes across the living room floor. His home didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt like his again. His phone buzzed on the counter, a new restitution notice just like the first, more payments scheduled, another step toward restoration. He didn't smile, but he felt something close to relief settle into him, soft and steady. The chapter of chaos was ending. Order had begun returning. And beneath the quiet, beneath the tiredness, beneath the scars, George could feel it. Healing had finally begun. But he knew one thing for certain. The road ahead still held pieces that needed to be put back together, and some of those pieces would take time. 3 months passed before George heard Eric's voice again, not through a panicked voicemail, not through a desperate text, but through a calm message left on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "Dad, if you're willing, I'd like to see you. Just talk. No asking for anything, just talk." George stood in his kitchen long after the message ended, the kettle whistling softly behind him. 3 months had changed many things: his home, his routines, the quietness inside him. But hearing Eric's voice again stirred something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. Still, the next day, he agreed to meet at a small park halfway between their homes. Neutral ground, open air, no walls to close around the past. When George arrived, Eric was already seated at a wooden picnic table, shoulders hunched, face thinner and older than his 37 years should have allowed. His hair had grown out unevenly, his clothes looked worn, and there was a tremor in his hands he tried to hide by clasping them together. "Hi, Dad," he said, voice small. George nodded. "Hi." They sat in silence for a long moment, branches rustling above them, a few children playing distantly near the swings. It was the kind of everyday scene that made the weight between them feel even heavier. Eric finally spoke. "I've been doing counseling," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "Court-ordered at first, but I kept going. They said I didn't have to, but I needed to." George waited, offering nothing yet. Eric swallowed hard. "They made me look at everything, not just the fraud, the pressure I let build, the choices I made, the way I blamed everyone except myself." He rubbed his palms together, ashamed. "I didn't realize how much I was drowning in my own ego, and in trying to impress Lindsay's family, and in trying to hide how small I felt next to their lifestyle." He looked up at George finally, eyes tired, earnest. "And the whole time I kept thinking you'd forgive me, that no matter what I did, you'd be there to fix it. I counted on it. I built my whole sense of safety on you." George's chest tightened. The truth hurt more than blame ever could. Eric continued, voice trembling. "It wasn't until the counseling sessions, until they made me say it out loud, that I understood something awful. I didn't just steal money, Dad. I stole your trust, your peace. I treated you like a backup plan, like an endless resource." George listened quietly, the wind pushing scattered leaves across the path beside them. Eric's voice cracked. "And I'm so sorry." There it was, the apology he had waited months to hear. Not frantic, not manipulative, not soaked in excuses, just raw honesty. But something inside George remained steady, grounded. "Eric," he said gently, "I needed to hear that, I truly did." Eric nodded, eyes shining with unshed tears. "But," George continued softly, "an apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rebuild everything overnight." "I know," Eric said immediately. "I'm not asking for that, I just needed to say it, to you." George leaned back slightly, considering his words. "You were consumed by things that didn't matter: image, impressing people, trying to look wealthier than you are. And in that process you forgot who you were, and who I am." Eric's throat tightened. "I know." George watched him, seeing his son, really seeing him for the first time in a long while. Fragile, humbled, broken open by the consequences he once tried so hard to outrun. "I won't rescue you," George said, steady and kind. "Not from the debt, not from the legal consequences, not from rebuilding your life. That's yours to climb out of." Eric nodded, shoulders trembling. "But," George added, "I'm not closing the door." Eric's head snapped. Up, eyes wide. "You're not." "No," George said, "but understand something very clearly: trust is earned, not given back because we share a name." Eric let out a small, broken sound, half sob, half exhale, as though he'd been holding his breath for months. "I'll earn it," he whispered, "even if it takes years." George didn't promise anything. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't offer money or absolution. But he did nod. And that nod, simple, quiet, steady, made Eric break. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he lowered his head into his hands, shoulders shaking with grief, relief, and the weight of the man he'd become. George didn't comfort him physically, but he stayed. He didn't stand, didn't walk away, didn't end the conversation early. He let Eric cry the way a grown man cries, silently, painfully, honestly. When the tears finally slowed, Eric wiped his face, embarrassed, but George shook his head softly. "No shame in tears," he murmured. Eric swallowed hard. "Thank you for meeting me, for listening." George nodded again. "We'll take this slowly, one step at a time." Eric stood, hesitating. "Can I see you again, maybe next week?" George didn't rush his answer. "Yes," he said, "next week." Relief washed over Eric like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Okay, I'll work hard, Dad." "I know," George said. They parted with no hug, no dramatic reconciliation, just a fragile understanding that something wounded wasn't healed, but no longer bleeding. A reconnection had begun, thin as thread, but real and growing. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the season itself understood George needed gentleness after so many months of upheaval. The snow retreated first, pulling back in thin, melting strips from the edges of his yard. Then the soil softened. Then the first buds peeked out from the maples lining the street. By mid-April, the air felt warmer, kinder, easier to breathe. George slipped into a routine he hadn't known he missed. Mornings spent tending to the small garden behind his house. He knelt in the dirt, coaxing life back into the flower beds his wife once loved, marigolds, tulips, basil, and rosemary. His hands worked slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of the earth, the steadiness of small tasks. In the afternoons, he cooked real meals again, not frozen dinners or quick sandwiches, but the hearty dishes he learned over decades of marriage. Beef stew, roast chicken, fresh bread. Aromas filled the house like returning memories. For the first time in months, quiet didn't equal dread. It simply meant peace. But George didn't retreat from the world. Detective O'Neill had approached him weeks earlier with a proposal: join a community program that supported local fraud victims, especially older adults who felt too embarrassed to admit they'd been exploited. George agreed. If his pain could help someone else avoid theirs, then maybe good could grow from the damage his own son had caused. He attended weekly sessions at the precinct, listening to stories from strangers who felt exactly the way he once had: small, blindsided, ashamed. He talked them through steps, told them where to begin, reminded them of something he'd forgotten until recently. "You're not foolish. Someone else was cruel." His voice carried weight now, experience, and people listened. Meanwhile, Eric began rebuilding his life in the background, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. He took a modest job with a contractor who agreed to look past his recent history. He rented a small apartment near the city line, far from the polished neighborhood he once shared with Lindsay. He showed up to counseling sessions twice a week, staying longer than required, asking questions, taking notes. He sent George occasional updates, not requests, not complaints, just small steps. Got my first paycheck. Finished session 12. Looking at weekend classes, carpentry maybe. George read each one, feeling a quiet thread of hope stretch between them. Not enough to pull them fully back together, but enough to hold a possibility. Lindsay, on the other hand, took the opposite path. She avoided responsibility like a shadow avoids light. Even as the investigation tightened around her, she crafted a narrative where she alone was the victim, misunderstood, mistreated, unfairly blamed. She moved in with her parents temporarily, though temporarily became far longer than she predicted. Her online presence faded, the motivational quotes stopped, people stopped engaging. When she walked into a room, conversations dimmed instead of brightened. Harold fared no better. Word spread quickly through his golf club and business circles that he'd been subpoenaed, that his family loan explanation fell apart under pressure, that the Dubai meltdown was only the public tip of the iceberg. His swagger evaporated. Former associates distanced themselves. Invitations dried up. His reputation, which he'd polished like a trophy, dulled almost overnight. George watched these Anges from a distance, not with satisfaction but with clarity. There was no triumph in their downfall, only an understanding he couldn't have reached months earlier. People reap what they cultivate. Some plant arrogance. Some plant lies. Some plant greed. And eventually their harvest comes. For the first time in a long while, George felt no anger when he thought of them. No burning resentment. No echo of humiliation. Only clarity, sharp, clean, freeing. Life settled into something steady again, predictable in the best ways. The kind of life where days didn't revolve around court dates, tense phone calls, or watching the door in dread. He walked every morning. He spent afternoons in the yard or the kitchen. He attended mentoring sessions. He responded to Eric's updates when appropriate, short, warm messages that offered encouragement but never replaced boundaries. His home felt safe again. His mind felt lighter. His heart, though still marked, was healing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the breeze carried the scent of soil and fresh grass through his open kitchen window, George stood quietly at the counter, hands resting on the cutting board, and realized something important. Life had become steady. Not perfect, not painless, but steady. And for the first time in a long while, steady felt like enough. Christmas came quietly that year, without the usual noise or expectations, without the pressure of forced smiles or elaborate traditions. The neighborhood was lit in soft strings of white and gold, wreaths hanging on doors, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting through the cold December air. George had decorated simply. A small tree by the window, a few ornaments his wife had loved, and a single candle glowing on the mantel. He wasn't expecting much from the day. He'd made peace with the idea of spending it alone, cooking a small meal for himself, maybe watching an old holiday movie. Peaceful, quiet, uncomplicated. Then around mid-afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just a gentle knock, hesitant, almost uncertain. George opened the door slowly. Eric stood on the porch wearing an old winter coat, hands shoved deep into the pockets, snow dusting his shoulders. His posture was humble, not collapsed in shame the way he'd been months earlier, but soft around the edges, like a man who understood just how fragile trust could be and how hard it was to rebuild. "Hi, Dad," Eric said quietly, breath forming small clouds in the cold air. George studied him for a long moment, taking in the changed face, the thinner cheeks, the calmer eyes, the steadiness he hadn't seen in years. This wasn't the man who had boarded a Dubai flight in arrogance and entitlement. This was someone who had been stripped down to the truth and was trying to rise from it. George stepped back. "Come in." Not an embrace, not an emotional welcome, just an invitation, careful, measured, but real. Eric entered slowly, looking around the living room with a kind of cautious nostalgia. "It looks the same," he murmured. George nodded. "Some things don't need changing." They sat at the small dining table, the one George had set for one. Without a word, he got up and added a second plate. The meal was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, a small pan of stuffing, but Eric looked at it like it was more than food, like it was permission to sit, breathe, be present. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the soft clink of utensils and the hum of the heating system cycling on. Finally, Eric spoke. "I didn't bring gifts," he said, voice low. I didn't think that was the right thing to do." George nodded slightly. "I didn't buy any either." Eric gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "Good." He cleared his throat. I just wanted to talk, if that's okay. George folded his hands. It is. Eric stared at the table, gathering courage. I know I've apologized before, but today I want to say it differently. George waited. Eric took a breath, letting it out shakily. I'm sorry, Dad, not just for the money, not for the court mess. I'm sorry for who I became, for letting pride drive me, for letting Lindsay push me, for making you feel like the world saw you as small or useless. His voice wavered. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. George didn't interrupt, didn't soothe, didn't rush him. Eric continued. The counseling, it forced me to look at myself, to admit things I didn't want to admit. I've been angry at you for years, about money, decisions, expectations. But the truth is, I was angry at myself. Angry that I couldn't measure up. Angry that I kept choosing the wrong people to impress. He swallowed hard. I promise you what happened. It will never happen again. Not anything close to it. I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to be that person. And I don't expect you to trust me right away or forgive me completely. But I want to earn my way back. George leaned back in his chair, absorbing every word. The honesty wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a performance, it felt lived in, hard won. Finally he spoke. Eric, trust is rebuilt in steps, not in speeches. Eric nodded quickly. I know, and I'm okay with that, really. George let the quiet settle for a moment, then said, You're trying, I see that, and that matters. Eric's eyes glistened, not with the collapse of earlier months, but with something steadier. Gratitude, relief, a fragile beginning. They talked for another hour, about counseling, about Eric's work, about the apartment he was trying to fix up, about nothing heavy, nothing sharp. Just two men sitting at a table, talking in a way they hadn't in years. No gifts. No forced holiday spirit. Just conversation and understanding. When Eric finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. Dad, thank you for letting me come. George nodded. Come again sometime. Eric's expression softened, hopeful, cautious, grateful. I will. He stepped out into the cold night, snowflakes drifting around him as he walked down the path. George closed the door gently and stood in the quiet house, the warmth lingering in the air. A step toward resolution had been taken. Small, unsteady, but real. The final restitution deposit arrived on a cold January morning, tucked neatly into George's online banking statement like a quiet period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. No warning, no flourish, just a number shifting from pending to completed. $80,000, returned in pieces across many months, now whole again. George stared at the screen for a long moment, not with excitement, not with triumph, but with a slow, exhaling sense of closure. The money mattered, of course. It represented safety, stability, the life he had built with discipline and care. But what settled over him wasn't joy over the dollars. It was something deeper. A returning of himself. He put on his coat, stepped out into the crisp winter air, and drove to the bank, something he hadn't done in person since the chaos had first erupted months ago. The lobby was warm and bright, filled with the faint hum of printers and soft conversation. Tyler spotted him almost immediately. Mr. Whitman, he said, standing from his desk with a genuine smile. You're looking good. George shook his hand. I came to thank you. I don't think I ever did it properly. Tyler's smile softened. You don't have to thank me. You were the one who acted fast. You made the call to freeze it mid-flight. Most people would have hesitated. I did hesitate, George admitted quietly, but I'm glad I didn't for long. Tyler nodded. What you did, it protected your future. A lot of people don't realize how quickly one bad incident can unravel everything. George clasped the young man's hand again. You helped save more than my account. As he stepped back into the cold, a familiar ringtone buzzed in his coat pocket. Detective O'Neill. Her voice came through steady, warm, carrying the same calm professionalism she had maintained from the beginning. "Mr. Whitman, I heard the final deposit went through," she said. "Wanted to congratulate you." "Thank you," George replied. "I'm relieved." "You should be," she said. "Most family-facilitated fraud cases don't resolve cleanly. Many victims back out or turn soft or lose hope halfway, but you stood firm the entire time." George let out a small breath. "Some days I didn't feel firm. Some days I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. But you remained steady where it mattered," she said. "And that's strength, not loud strength, real strength." George swallowed, emotion settling gently behind his ribs. "I appreciate everything you did." "Take care of yourself, George," she said before hanging up. "You earned this peace." When he returned home, the house was quiet. The tree from Christmas was gone. The living room had settled back into its simple winter rhythm. He hung his coat, made himself a cup of tea, and sat near the fireplace as flames crackled their steady, familiar song. His phone buzzed once more, a text from Eric. "Dad, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you for giving me space to rebuild. I'm keeping my word. I hope this year brings you peace. No assumptions. No overstepping. Just respect." George typed back a short message. "Thank you, Eric. Wishing you a peaceful year too." Not emotional, not cold, balanced. A bridge not repaired but built upon. He set the phone aside and leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the fire soak into him. The journey replayed in fragments: the initial shock, the fear, the humiliation, the freezing of the account, the courtrooms, the confessions, the slow rebuilding. None of it had been easy. None of it had been quick. But for the first time, George didn't feel like a victim of his son's choices. He felt like a man who had taken his life back. Not through fury, not through destruction, but through boundaries, firm, clear, and long overdue. He lifted the warm mug to his lips, watching the flames dance, feeling the peace settle around him like a soft blanket. A smile crept over his face, small, private, real. And in the quiet glow of the fire, he whispered to himself, "Freezing that account didn't just save my money, it saved me."